In September of 2016, 38-year-old park ranger Daniel Cross disappeared while on routine patrol in the remote backcountry northeast of Yosemite National Park. He vanished along with his horse, a 12-year-old bay gelding named Cisco, during what should have been a standard 3-day wilderness survey in the high country near the park's eastern boundary. When Daniel failed to check in on his third day, his supervisor initiated a search. Teams combed the area for 2 weeks, finding only scattered signs of his passage, a campfire ring at one of the designated backcountry sites, boot prints near a creek, a single leather glove caught in brush. But there was no trace of Daniel himself, and no sign of Cisco. The investigation stretched through autumn and into winter, yielding nothing but questions. Then, 4 months later, on a cold January morning, Cisco appeared at the Tuolumne Meadows Ranger Station, alone, exhausted, carrying saddlebags that hadn't been there when Daniel left. Inside one of the bags was a hand-drawn map, sketched in pencil on water-stained paper, showing terrain that no one in the Park Service recognized. The map would become the center of an investigation that would consume 2 years, mobilize search teams across 3 counties, and ultimately reveal something far stranger than anyone had anticipated. On September 8, 2016, just after dawn, Daniel Cross saddled Cisco at the Tuolumne Meadows stable complex. It was early autumn, the high country still accessible before the first major snowfall closed the passes and sent most seasonal staff down to lower elevations. Daniel was beginning his 23rd season with the National Park Service, 15 of those years spent at Yosemite. He'd grown up in Wyoming, learned to ride before he could read, and had worked as a wilderness ranger in Grand Teton before transferring to California. His colleagues knew him as steady, competent, and unusually comfortable with solitude. He was the ranger who volunteered for the longest backcountry patrols, the one who seemed most at home in the wilderness, far from roads and visitor centers and the crowds that packed the valley floor in summer. His assignment that week was straightforward. He was to ride a wide loop through the high country east of Tuolumne, checking on trail conditions, documenting any erosion or fallen trees, and assessing the status of several backcountry campsites before winter arrived. The route would take him through an area of granite peaks and alpine meadows, past a string of remote lakes, and eventually loop back to Tuolumne after 3 days. It was terrain he knew well, country he'd patrolled many times before. He carried standard equipment, camping gear, food for 4 days, a satellite phone, GPS unit, maps, and his service radio. Cisco was a reliable animal, steady on rough terrain, experienced in backcountry work. There was no reason to expect trouble. Daniel's supervisor, Chief Ranger Margaret Torres, watched him ride out that morning. She'd later tell investigators that Daniel had seemed relaxed, in good spirits. He joked about the weather forecast, which called for clear skies and warm days, unusual for September at that elevation. Before leaving, he'd filed his route plan, marking his intended campsites on the office map, noting his expected return on September 11th. Everything was by the book, exactly as protocol required. As Cisco's hoofbeats faded into the forest, Torres had returned to her office, thinking nothing more about it. It was a routine patrol. Daniel had done dozens just like it. The first night, Daniel camped at Glen Allen, a designated backcountry site near a series of waterfalls. Another ranger hiking through the area spotted his camp from a distance, but didn't approach. Wilderness rangers typically gave each other space, unless there was a specific need to communicate. The camp looked normal. A small fire, the horse picketed nearby, a figure moving around the tent in the fading light. The next morning, the camp was gone when the other ranger passed through again, which was expected. Daniel should have been moving on to his second night's location, deeper into the backcountry. On September 10th, Daniel was supposed to check in via satellite phone at noon. The protocol for backcountry rangers required twice daily communications, once at noon and once at 6 in the evening, brief calls to confirm position and status. When noon came and went without contact, Torres wasn't immediately concerned. Satellite coverage could be spotty in the high country, blocked by peaks or deep valleys. She waited. By 6 that evening, when Daniel still hadn't called, concern began to edge into worry. She tried calling his satellite phone. It rang but went unanswered. She tried his radio. Nothing. At 8 that evening, she contacted the park's dispatch center and reported Daniel as overdue on his check-in. The Park Service has specific protocols for overdue personnel, escalating responses based on how much time has passed and the circumstances of the overdue status. In Daniel's case, he was only 6 hours late on a check-in, not yet officially missing. The decision was made to wait until morning. If he hadn't made contact by then, a search would be initiated. Torres spent that night in her office, trying the satellite phone every hour. Each time, it rang into silence. By morning, she knew something was wrong. September 11th dawned clear and cold. At 7, Torres assembled a search team. 4 rangers on horseback, 2 more on foot, and a helicopter crew standing by at the valley floor. The horse team rode out immediately, following Daniel's planned route. They reached Glen Allen by late morning, found the campsite Daniel had used 2 nights before, documented it carefully. The fire ring showed recent use. The ground where he'd picketed Cisco was clearly marked with hoof prints. Everything looked routine. They continued on, following the trail Daniel should have taken toward his second campsite near a place called Waterwheel Falls. By afternoon, they'd covered 10 miles without finding any further sign. The trail here was granite and rock, not conducive to tracking. They reached the area where Daniel should have camped on his second night, a flat space near the creek with a designated fire ring. There was no evidence he'd stopped there. No fire, no tracks, no sign of recent human presence. This was the first indication that Daniel had deviated from his planned route. The question was why and where he'd gone instead. The team split up, expanding the search radius, calling Daniel's name, listening for any response. They heard only the wind and the distant rush of water. The helicopter arrived in mid-afternoon, flying a grid pattern over the search area. The pilot and observer scanned the ground below, looking for any sign of a camp, a rider, a horse, anything that might indicate where Daniel had gone. The terrain here was harsh, open granite slabs interspersed with patches of forest, steep-sided valleys, and exposed ridgelines. There were 1,000 places a person could be, visible from the air or hidden completely, depending on the exact location. They flew until dusk, seeing nothing. On the ground, the search teams established a base camp and prepared to continue the next day. Over the following week, the search expanded dramatically. More rangers arrived from other parks. Search and rescue volunteers came from surrounding counties. The operation grew to involve more than 60 people, teams on foot and horseback, helicopters, search dogs. They covered hundreds of square miles, checking every drainage, every meadow, every possible route Daniel might have taken. They found small pieces of evidence that proved he'd been in the area. A boot print in soft soil near a creek, distinctive because of the tread pattern that matched Daniel's issued boots. A place where a horse had been tied to a tree, bark rubbed smooth in a way that suggested recent use. A campfire ring that hadn't been there during the last patrol 2 weeks earlier. But these scattered traces didn't form a coherent trail. They suggested Daniel had been moving through the backcountry, but not in any logical pattern. He seemed to have wandered off his intended route, heading northeast into increasingly remote terrain. One of the search teams, working an area near Matterhorn Peak, found Daniel's satellite phone. It was lying on a rock beside a small stream, placed there deliberately, not dropped or lost. The phone was undamaged and still had battery life, but the last attempted call logged on, it was Daniel's noon check-in on September 10th, the call that had gone unanswered because he'd apparently set the phone down and walked away from it before anyone called back. This discovery deepened the mystery. Why would Daniel leave his primary means of communication behind? The phone's GPS showed its location history, confirming that Daniel had indeed been on his planned route initially, but then had veered northeast, away from the designated trails, into a section of the park that saw almost no foot traffic. The GPS track ended at the location where the phone was found. After that, there was no electronic record of where he'd gone. The search continued through September and into early October. As the weather deteriorated and the first snow began to fall at higher elevations, the operation had to be scaled back. Teams couldn't safely operate in the increasingly harsh conditions. The decision was made to suspend active searching until the following spring, though the case would remain open and rangers would continue to watch for any sign of Daniel during their winter patrols of the lower elevations. Margaret Torres made the announcement to the assembled search teams on October 15th. Her voice was steady, but her face showed the strain of 5 weeks of fruitless searching. "We've covered every reasonable area where Daniel could have gone. We found traces of his passage, but no indication of what happened to him. At this point, with winter coming, we have to acknowledge that survival becomes increasingly unlikely. We'll resume in the spring, but for now, we have to step back. Daniel's family, his parents, and a younger sister had come to Yosemite during the search. They'd stayed at the Valley Lodge, waiting for news that never came. His mother couldn't accept that her son had simply vanished. "He knows these mountains," she told anyone who would listen. "He's been doing this for 20 years. He wouldn't just get lost. Something happened to him." The Park Service agreed that Daniel's experience made a simple case of getting lost unlikely, but they had no alternative explanation that fit the evidence. There were no signs of animal attack, no indication of injury or accident at any of the sites where his traces had been found. His gear, beyond the satellite phone, had not been recovered. Neither had Cisco. It was as if rider and horse had simply ridden off the edge of the world. The case attracted media attention, particularly in California. Park ranger disappearances were rare enough to be newsworthy, and the mysterious circumstances, the abandoned phone, the seemingly purposeful deviation from a planned route, gave the story an edge of intrigue. Speculation ran wild on social media and in online forums dedicated to missing persons cases. Some suggested Daniel had deliberately disappeared, walked away from his life for reasons unknown. Others proposed more sinister scenarios: abduction, foul play, though there was no evidence to support such theories. A few ventured into stranger territory, suggesting involvement of unexplained phenomena, a theory that gained traction among those who believed that national parks harbored mysteries beyond conventional explanation. Park Service officials declined to speculate publicly, sticking to the facts. Daniel Cross was missing. The search was ongoing, though suspended for winter, and anyone with information was urged to come forward. Winter settled over the high country. Snow piled deep in the passes and meadows where Daniel had disappeared. The case file sat on Margaret Torres's desk, reviewed periodically but yielding no new insights. She'd assigned a ranger to monitor any reports that might relate to the case: unusual sightings, found equipment, anything that might provide a lead. The months passed. November, December. The park was quiet, most facilities closed, only essential staff remaining. Tuolumne Meadows was buried under several feet of snow, inaccessible except by snowshoe or ski. On the morning of January 18, 2017, a park maintenance worker named Thomas Wu was driving a snowplow along the Tioga Road near the Tuolumne Meadows Ranger Station when he saw something that made him stop. A horse was standing in the middle of the road. It was a bay gelding, thin and shaggy with winter coat, but alive and apparently uninjured. Wu approached carefully. The horse didn't spook, just stood there, breathing vapor into the cold air. Wu recognized the animal immediately. It was Cisco, Daniel Cross's horse, missing for more than 4 months. Wu called it in immediately. Within an hour, Margaret Torres and 2 other rangers had made the drive up from the valley, chains on their tires, navigating the barely plowed road. They found Cisco standing near the ranger station corral, where Wu had managed to coax him with a bucket of grain. The horse was in surprisingly good condition, considering how long he'd been missing. He was thin but not starving. His coat was rough, but he showed no signs of injury or frostbite. Most remarkably, he was still wearing his saddle and bridle, though both were weathered and worn. The saddlebags were still attached, bulging with something inside. Torres approached slowly, speaking in a low voice. Cisco nickered softly, recognizing her. She ran her hands over his body, checking for wounds, finding none. She unbuckled the saddlebags and opened them. Inside the right bag was moldy food, Daniel's camp supplies, a first aid kit. Inside the left bag was a bundle wrapped in a plastic rain cover. Torres carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a notebook, its pages damp and wrinkled but still legible, and a large piece of paper, folded multiple times. She unfolded the paper and her breath caught. It was a map, hand-drawn in pencil, showing terrain that she didn't recognize. The map was detailed, almost obsessively so, showing ridges and valleys, streams and meadows, with notations in handwriting she recognized as Daniel's. At the bottom of the map, in the same handwriting, were 3 words that made her blood run cold. Can't find way. The notebook contained entries dated from September 9th through September 24th, more than 2 weeks after Daniel had been expected to return. Torres stood in the snow, reading by the thin winter sunlight, as the other rangers tended to Cisco. The entries started normally, routine observations about trail conditions and wildlife sightings. But by the third day, Daniel's tone had changed. Something strange about the terrain here. GPS not matching the maps. Landmarks don't line up. Thought I knew where I was, but nothing looks right. The entries became increasingly confused and agitated. September 12th. Tried to backtrack to the trail. Can't find it. Everything looks the same. Rock and trees. Cisco is nervous. September 14th. Been riding in circles for 2 days. The sun's position doesn't make sense. Compass acting strange. Need to find water. September 17th. Found a valley that's not on any map. Drew it as best I can. Going to try heading west tomorrow. Have to get out of here. The later entries were harder to read, the handwriting less steady. Daniel wrote about running low on food, about Cisco becoming increasingly difficult to manage. He mentioned seeing things he couldn't explain, lights in the distance at night, rock formations that seemed to move or shift position. Some entries suggested he thought he was being watched, though he never saw anyone. On September 23rd, don't know how much longer I can keep this up. Cisco won't go certain directions. Something wrong with this place. If anyone finds this, the map shows where I've been. Tell them I tried to get back. The final entry was dated September 24th and consisted of only a few words. Going to try one more direction. If this doesn't work, I don't know what else to do. Torres closed the notebook and looked at the map again. It showed a complex landscape of valleys and ridgelines, with Daniel's camp locations marked at intervals. She pulled out her park map and tried to match the features. Nothing corresponded. The valleys on Daniel's map were too numerous, the distances between features too great. It was as if he'd been riding through a completely different piece of country. She radioed down to park headquarters, requested immediate assistance, and carefully placed the map and notebook in evidence bags. Cisco was loaded into a horse trailer and transported down to the valley, where a veterinarian would examine him. The investigation, dormant for 4 months, had suddenly and dramatically been resurrected. The map became the focus of intensive analysis. Rangers, geologists, and cartography experts studied it, trying to identify the terrain it depicted. The consensus was baffling. The landscape Daniel had drawn didn't match anything in Yosemite or the surrounding national forest. The scale seemed wrong, the topography inconsistent with known features. Some of the valleys he'd sketched were oriented in directions that didn't exist in the actual terrain where he'd been known to be traveling. It was as if he'd somehow been navigating through a landscape that had no correlation to reality. A forensic analysis of the notebook confirmed that it was indeed Daniel's handwriting and that the entries had been written over the course of several weeks. The paper showed water damage consistent with exposure to rain or snow, and there were traces of soil and plant matter that matched the high country environment. Everything about the physical evidence was consistent with what Daniel's account described. He'd been out there, moving through the wilderness, for at least 2 weeks longer than anyone had realized. But where exactly had he been? The discovery of Cisco and the map triggered a renewed search effort. Teams returned to the high country as soon as winter conditions permitted. In late May of 2017, they focused on the area northeast of Tuolumne, where Daniel had last been known to be, using the map as a guide even though no one could definitively correlate it to actual terrain. Search and rescue specialists studied Daniel's descriptions of landmarks, trying to identify anything that might provide a clue. They hiked into remote valleys, climbed peaks that offered vantage points, flew helicopters over vast stretches of wilderness. They were looking for any sign of Daniel, or any explanation for how he could have become so thoroughly disoriented in country he knew well. In June, a search team made a discovery that deepened the mystery further. In a remote drainage on the north side of Matterhorn Peak, they found a camp that matched one of the locations Daniel had marked on his map. There was a fire ring, remnants of a tent site, and carved into a tree was a date, the 16th of September 2016. This confirmed that Daniel had indeed been in that location 8 days after he'd disappeared. But the drainage itself was nearly 15 miles from where his satellite phone had been found, a distance that should have taken a day or two of travel at most. Yet, according to his journal, it had taken him a week to cover that ground, and he described traveling through several distinct valleys to get there, none of which existed between the two locations. It was as if the geography had been different for him, or as if he'd been traveling through terrain that somehow didn't correspond to the actual landscape. More camps were found over the summer, each one matching a location on Daniel's map, but situated in ways that didn't make sense when plotted on an actual survey map. The distances were wrong, the directions inconsistent. Geologists examined the areas where camps had been found, looking for anything unusual, magnetic anomalies, unusual rock formations, anything that might explain how an experienced ranger with good equipment could become so disoriented. They found nothing out of the ordinary. The rock was granite, typical for the Sierra Nevada. The magnetic field was normal. There were no hidden valleys or concealed terrain features that could account for Daniel's confusion. By autumn of 2017, the search had been suspended again. Despite finding several of Daniel's campsites and confirming that he'd survived in the wilderness for at least 2 weeks, there was still no trace of Daniel himself. The map, far from solving the mystery, had only deepened it. Where was the country it depicted? How had Daniel become lost in a landscape he knew intimately? And most pressingly, what had happened to him after his last journal entry on September 24th? 4 months before Cisco had emerged from the wilderness, carrying the evidence of Daniel's ordeal? Theories proliferated, though none were entirely satisfying. Some suggested that Daniel had suffered a medical event, perhaps a stroke or brain injury, that had affected his perception and navigation abilities. This could explain the confusion and the feeling that landmarks didn't match up. But it didn't explain how he'd functioned well enough to survive for weeks, make detailed maps, and care for his horse. Others proposed that Daniel had encountered something psychological, a dissociative episode or acute stress reaction that had altered his judgment. Again, this seemed inconsistent with the lucid, if increasingly desperate tone of his journal entries. A few pointed to the possibility of environmental factors, unusual weather patterns or atmospheric conditions that could have affected his compass or GPS, but tests of recovered equipment showed it had been functioning normally. Then there were the more unconventional theories, the ones that Margaret Torres and other park officials didn't discuss publicly but couldn't entirely dismiss privately. Daniel had written in his journal about the terrain not making sense, about the sun's position being wrong, about compass readings that seemed contradictory. He'd mentioned rock formations that seemed to move and lights in the distance. These details had echoes in other disappearance cases in national parks, cases where experienced outdoors people had become lost in familiar terrain and described similar sensations of disorientation and wrongness. Some researchers who studied these cases suggested that certain areas of wilderness might harbor environmental anomalies, places where standard navigation became unreliable, where the normal rules of orientation ceased to apply. It was a fringe theory, not taken seriously by mainstream science, but it offered one of the few explanations that fit the facts of Daniel's case. Cisco, meanwhile, had recovered from his ordeal. The veterinary examination had found him to be in remarkable condition, considering his months in the wilderness. He'd survived the winter, somehow finding enough food and avoiding predators and the worst of the weather. When spring came, he'd made his way back to familiar ground, back to the ranger station where he'd been stabled, carrying the evidence that would tell at least part of Daniel's story. Horses had strong homing instincts, and Cisco had proven it, but he couldn't tell the searchers where he'd been or what had become of his rider. The investigation officially shifted from search and rescue to recovery and analysis. Daniel Cross was presumed dead, though no body had been recovered. The Park Service held a memorial service in October 2017, attended by his family, colleagues, and representatives from parks across the country. Daniel was remembered for his dedication, his skill, his love of the wilderness he'd spent his career protecting. His name was added to the list of Park Service employees who died in the line of duty, joining the 41 law enforcement rangers who'd been killed since 1913, and the dozens of other park employees who'd lost their lives in service. A plaque was installed at the Tuolumne Meadows Ranger Station, bearing his name and dates, and a simple inscription, "Lost in the wild country he loved." But for those who'd been closest to the case, closure was elusive. Margaret Torres kept the map in her office, studying it during quiet moments, trying to understand what it represented. She'd worked in Yosemite for 25 years, knew its backcountry as well as anyone, but the landscape Daniel had drawn remained utterly alien to her. She sometimes wondered if the map depicted an internal landscape, Daniel's deteriorating mental state rendered in topographic form. But that didn't account for the physical camps they'd found, the tangible evidence that he'd been in real locations, even if his perception of those locations had been profoundly distorted. In 2018, a magazine journalist writing about unsolved Park Service cases contacted Torres and requested an interview. She agreed, carefully, not wanting to sensationalize Daniel's disappearance, but hoping that wider coverage might generate new leads. The article, published in Outside Magazine, detailed Daniel's case alongside several others, drawing attention to the phenomenon of missing persons in national parks. The story generated renewed interest, and tips came in from across the country. None led anywhere substantial. Several psychics and dowsers contacted the park, claiming they could locate Daniel's remains using their abilities. Torres politely declined their offers. A few conspiracy theorists showed up at the park, convinced that Daniel had stumbled onto something the government wanted hidden and had been silenced. Security had to escort them off park grounds. Through all of this, the map remained. Copies were made and distributed to search and rescue teams, to rangers across the park system, to anyone who might recognize the terrain or have insight into what it represented. Geologists and cartographers continued to analyze it. One expert noted that the valley orientations, while not matching actual Yosemite topography, were consistent with landscape features that might exist elsewhere, perhaps in a different part of the Sierra Nevada or in an entirely different mountain range. This led to a brief effort to search outside the immediate area to see if Daniel had somehow traveled much further than seemed possible. Teams checked areas in the Emigrant Wilderness and the Hoover Wilderness, regions north and northeast of Yosemite. They found nothing. Cisco lived out his retirement in a pasture in the valley, no longer fit for backcountry work but treated as something of a legend among Park Service personnel. Visitors who heard the story would sometimes ask to see him, and rangers would oblige, leading small groups to the fence where the old horse grazed peacefully. He'd become a living connection to an unsolved mystery, the sole survivor of whatever had happened in that remote country in September 2016. In his own way, Cisco had done his job. He'd brought back the evidence. It just wasn't evidence that anyone could fully interpret. In 2019, 3 years after Daniel's disappearance, a solo hiker named Kevin Martinez was backpacking through a remote area near the northeast boundary of the park, well off established trails. Martinez was an experienced mountaineer, drawn to the most remote and challenging terrain. On the third day of his trip, while climbing a steep talus slope, he noticed something wedged between two boulders about 30 feet above him. He scrambled up to investigate and found a weathered boot. Inside the boot were the remains of a human foot. Martinez marked the location carefully, photographed everything without disturbing it, and hiked out to report his discovery. The remains were recovered and sent for analysis. Dental records confirmed what everyone already suspected. The remains belonged to Daniel Cross. A search of the immediate area turned up more scattered bones, pieces of clothing, and a few personal items, including Daniel's ranger badge and his wedding ring. Though he'd never been married, the ring had belonged to his father, and Daniel had worn it on a chain around his neck. The remains were scattered over a wide area, consistent with predator activity. Based on the degree of decomposition and weathering, forensic anthropologists estimated that Daniel had been dead since late September or early October of 2016, roughly consistent with the date of his last journal entry. But the location of the remains raised as many questions as it answered. Daniel's body had been found more than 25 miles from where his last confirmed campsite had been located, in an area that would have required several days of extremely difficult travel to reach. The terrain between his last known position and where he died was among the most rugged in the park, a landscape of vertical cliffs, loose scree, and impassable canyons. It seemed impossible that he could have traveled that distance, especially while deteriorating physically and mentally as his journal suggested. Yet there he was, or what remained of him. The medical examiner's report listed cause of death as exposure and dehydration, consistent with being lost in the wilderness without adequate supplies. There was evidence of multiple injuries, broken ribs, a fractured wrist, suggesting falls or difficult travel over rough terrain. But there was nothing to explain how Daniel had ended up where he had, or why his perception of the landscape had been so radically at odds with reality. The case file was officially closed in December 2019. Daniel Cross had been found, his death confirmed, his remains returned to his family for burial. By all bureaucratic measures, the case was resolved, but the map remained unexplained. In the final case report, investigators noted that the document showed a landscape that does not correspond to any known terrain in or around Yosemite National Park. The reasons for this discrepancy cannot be definitively determined. Possible explanations include disorientation due to injury or illness, environmental factors affecting navigation equipment, or psychological factors affecting perception and judgment. The report concluded with a recommendation that rangers be provided with additional training in recognizing and responding to severe disorientation, and that protocols be reviewed for solo backcountry patrols. Margaret Torres retired from the Park Service in 2020. She'd spent 40 years with the agency, the last 15 at Yosemite. Before she left, she donated several items to the park's historical collection, including Daniel's map. It sits now in the archives, carefully preserved in acid-free storage, available to researchers by appointment. Occasionally someone comes to study it, usually a graduate student working on a thesis about navigation and cognitive psychology, or a journalist researching an article about missing persons. They all leave puzzled, unable to reconcile the detailed, carefully drawn landscape with the known geography of the area where Daniel disappeared. The Tuolumne Meadows Ranger Station still has Daniel's memorial plaque, now weathered by 4 winters. Rangers who work there tell his story to visitors who ask about it, sticking to the established facts but sometimes, in quieter moments with fellow rangers, acknowledging the deeper strangeness of the case. The valley where Daniel's remains were found has no official name, but informally, some rangers have started calling it Cross Canyon, a small recognition of the man who died there under circumstances that remain, despite the recovery of his body, fundamentally mysterious. Cisco passed away in 2021 at the age of 17. He was buried in a small cemetery near the park stables, where horses and mules that had served the park were laid to rest. A simple marker notes his years of service. For those who remember the case, Cisco represents something beyond a faithful animal who returned home. He represents the one witness to whatever happened in that high country in September 2016, the one being who could answer the questions that still linger. But horses cannot speak, and whatever Cisco saw or experienced during those 4 months in the wilderness died with him. Daniel's family has never fully accepted the conclusion that he simply became lost. His sister, in interviews, has pointed out that Daniel was expert level in wilderness navigation, that he'd taught orienteering courses, that he'd spent thousands of hours in backcountry environments without ever having serious navigation problems. She believes something happened to him, something beyond the scope of official explanations. She keeps a copy of the map in her home, has it framed on her wall, and sometimes she traces the valleys and ridges her brother drew, trying to see what he saw, trying to understand how familiar country could become so alien and disorienting that an expert could be lost within it until death. She has no answers. Only questions and grief, and the strange map that is the last communication from a brother who walked into the wilderness and never came home. Today, rangers working in the high country around Tuolumne carry Daniel's case in their collective memory. Some report feeling uneasy in certain remote valleys, sensing a wrongness they can't articulate. A few have described experiences similar to what Daniel wrote about, brief moments where landmarks seem unfamiliar or directions seem confused, though these episodes never last long enough to cause serious problems. Whether these experiences reflect some genuine peculiarity of the terrain or simply the power of suggestion and knowledge of Daniel's fate is impossible to determine. What is certain is that the wilderness northeast of Tuolumne Meadows carries a weight now, a sense of something unresolved. The map remains, silent and inscrutable. Sometimes staff at the park archives will take it out and study it, comparing it against modern topographic maps and satellite imagery, looking for anything they might have missed. They never find it. The landscape Daniel drew exists nowhere in the physical world, or at least nowhere that has been identified. It exists only on paper, a record of perception and experience that cannot be reconciled with measurable reality. In this sense, the map is a perfect artifact of mystery, proof that something happened, documentation that cannot be interpreted, evidence of an experience that cannot be explained. For rangers who work alone in the backcountry, Daniel Cross's disappearance serves as a reminder of how quickly the familiar can become strange, how thin the line is between competence and catastrophe, how even expertise and preparation cannot fully protect against the unknown variables that wilderness can present. They check their equipment more carefully now, make more frequent radio calls, pay closer attention to subtle signs of disorientation, and they wonder, quietly, if they ever find themselves in Daniel's position. Would they be able to find their way back, or would they too wander lost through a landscape that had become, somehow, unmapped and unknown, until the wilderness claimed them as it had claimed him? The story of Daniel Cross and the map that cannot be read has become part of Yosemite's darker lore, shared among rangers and visitors who are drawn to the mysterious and unexplained. It exists alongside other park mysteries, disappearances that were never solved, deaths that never made sense, places that seem to generate more than their share of incidents and misfortune. These stories form an unofficial counter-narrative to the park's official image of pristine beauty and manageable risk, a reminder that wilderness retains its essential wildness, its capacity to confound and endanger even those who know it best. And somewhere in the archives, on that carefully preserved piece of paper, valleys and ridges mark a landscape that no one has ever seen, a terrain drawn by a man who wandered lost until he died, trying desperately to map his way home through country that shouldn't exist. The map waits, as it has waited for years, for someone who might finally recognize the features it depicts, who might be able to say with certainty, this is where he was, this is what he saw, this is why he couldn't find his way. Until then, it remains what it has always been: evidence of mystery, proof of the unexplained, and a silent testimony to the truth that some who enter the wilderness do not return, and that what they experience there may forever exceed our ability to understand or explain.